Everyone, I think that we're going to get started and begin. So thank you for being here. My name is Aaron Erie, and I'm an Institute Associate here at the Liberalism Studies program. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event on William Galston's new book, Anger, Fear, Domination, Dark Passions, and the Power of Political Speech. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, let me just remind you that there will be a Q&A portion at the end of this event. Please do formulate your questions as questions and try to be as concise as you can, so as many people as possible get a chance to ask their questions. So with that, let me introduce tonight's guests. William A. Galston holds the Ezra K. Zilkin Chair in the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program, where he served as a senior fellow. His books include Anti-Pluralism, The Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy, and his latest, Anger, Fear, Domination, which we will be discussing today. Kristen Collins is a political theorist and senior fellow at the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Her research interests include the history of political thought and contemporary democratic theory, especially the effects of inequality and surveillance on political life. She is currently working on a book on how Enlightenment-era theories of the politics of theater and spectatorship can help us criticize public and private forms of surveillance. She also hosts Virtual Sentiments, a podcast on the ethics and politics of digital technology from a historical perspective. Finally, moderating tonight is our own Laura K. Field, who is a writer in Washington, D.C. and a program associate here at the Liberalism Studies program. She studied political theory and public law at the University of Texas at Austin, has held faculty positions at Rhodes College, Georgetown, and American universities, and today is a scholar in residence at American University and senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. She has worked extensively on the right wing, the so-called New Right, intellectuals who rose to prominence under the Trump administrations. Her book, Furious Minds, The Making of the Mega New Right, is out now from Princeton University Press. I would also humbly ask you to watch the recording of the event that we did before on her book, which can be found on our YouTube page. With that, I will now turn it over to Laura if she wants to make a few remarks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you all for coming. It's kind of late in the season, and we're so thrilled to have Bill here. I'll say a little bit. I'm not going to say too much. I did a podcast interview of Bill that will be out, I guess, next month, so I've had my chance to ask him my questions about the book. But I do want to say just a couple things about Bill and about the book, which is sort of preaching to the choir. This book, I love Bill's way of writing, and I love the themes he's taking up, so I'm a partisan for the book. But Bill is one of the preeminent liberal thinkers and theorists of our time. He has a genuine command of liberal philosophy that is rare and in true commitment to it. And I think what I especially appreciate in conversations with Bill and also reading his work is just the direct, lucid, and clear capacity to speak to things that are kind of thorny and theoretical, and I find difficult, but you do not, and I really appreciate, I don't think you do, or after many years of doing this, you are just sort of solid and lucid in a way where I sort of stumble and trip up. So I love speaking with you, I love learning from you, and the new book is a demonstration of this facility. So we've got Anger, Dark Passions, and the Power of Political Speech. It's a short book, it's an elegant book. I think that the subtitle could also have been Liberal Pathologies, Dark Passions, and the Power of Political Speech, because it's a three-part book, right? The first part is about some of the, I guess I'll just call it pathologies again, of liberal illusions is more how you speak about it. So the first part, there's a brief introduction, but then you go through these problems with liberals as you see them today, or us today, naivete. He said the idea that liberalism is easy, that history is progressive, that human nature is benign. And Bill's book is kind of a wake-up call that says, no, it's not that simple. There are certain passions we cannot tame, and you shouldn't delude yourself into that. And it's kind of a dose or injection of a kind of Hobbesian realism into our, not just that, more than that, but at least partly a dose of realism to us liberals. The second part is about the dark passions and kind of this tour through the dark parts of our psyche, including anger here, anger, hatred, humiliation, revenge, the desire for revenge, fear and its liabilities, and then of course the urge to dominate. And then the third part, which is probably my favorite, is about the power of rhetoric, and rhetoric understood not as something kind of to be skeptical about or fearful of, or that's kind of manipulative, not as a manipulative force so much as a force for potential assuaging of the dark passions, and as something elevated in an Aristotelian sense that can be used in politics in a much more generative way. Well, generative might be a word you wouldn't use, but at least in a powerful and important way. So there's a lot to discuss here. I think your book is in conversation with the broader discourse in really interesting ways. So that's all I'll say for now. Kristen, I don't think you're going to need much moderation between for this discussion between the two of you, but we're delighted to have you, Bill, and Kristen too. So take it away.
Great, yeah, no, excellent project, Bill, and excellent book. I do recommend everybody check it out. And first thing I wanted to start with is DC is a town full of think tanks and universities, scholars, journalists. But the interesting thing is that even though we're all political theorists affiliated with think tanks, I think we're in the minority of who is typically hired, who is typically necessarily the focus of, often a focus on quantitative political science, on economics. But I think in this moment, since at least 2016, but I think longer than that, we've seen the cracks in the foundations of liberal democracy, and I think that is the time when you need to be talking about these basic fundamental principles undergirding our institutions, as well as our moral culture and our kind of visions of human nature. And so what I love about your work, Bill, is that it combines, like Laura was saying, this very lucid, clear analysis of a deep history of intellectual thought and of theoretical principles with, I think, a very experienced, thoughtful grasp of recent politics in the 20th and 21st century. And so the first thing that I kind of wanted to get us started with was to invite you, I'm sure there's more thoughts that you'd want to frame the conversation with, but also to invite you to speak on how your experiences in your career, both having the more theoretical, intellectual history background and your experience in policy, having conversation with policymakers in public policy and as both like an academic and a practical field. How did that shape this book and also the decision to write this book in this moment?
Well, first of all, this book is very much of this moment. And I felt impelled to write it. I published my first book 50 years ago, almost exactly 50 years ago. And this was a book, as I said, I felt I had to write, to try to understand the moment we're in, but to understand it not simply as a moment, but as an instance of phenomena that have recurred throughout recorded history. When I was an undergraduate, I passionately studied classical Greek thought. And that thought has a real influence on a substantial portion of this book. I've often said that it's a good thing that Aristotle and Augustine are dead and that all of their works are squarely in the public domain, because otherwise those two esteemed gentlemen would be suing me for plagiarism. Right? The chapters on anger and fear are very much influenced by Aristotle's rhetoric. And the section on domination is straight out of Augustine. I would say on that basis, this isn't Hobbesian realism so much as Aristotelian and Augustinian realism, which is a distinction with something of a difference, but not as much as you might imagine. With the emphasis on the noun realism. And I'll get to the other half of your invitation / provocation in just a minute. I have gotten too old, to entertain hopes that I no longer believe in, right? And I've gotten too old not to reflect on many of the things that I once believed in and hoped for are unlikely. Why is that? Well, as you mentioned, not only have I spent a lot of my time in dialogue with policy professionals, but as some of you know, I've wandered in and out of American politics for 45 years. I have been in 6 presidential campaigns, and I spent 2.5 years in Bill Clinton's White House as number 2 on the Domestic Policy Council. And those experiences are an education in the reality of politics, for better and for worse. The reality what actually drives people, once again, for better and worse. I have seen peaks of nobility and troughs of selfishness, or worse. It's very hard to read or do political philosophy the same way after you've had those sorts of experiences for yourself. And this has led me to a maxim, and that is that political philosophy is about politics. It's not about political philosophy. And it was born as a discipline or a way of thinking out of the direct experience that people starting in classical Greece and Rome had with the real stuff of politics, and which is not to say that you're driven away necessarily from ideas of nobility and devotion to the common good, but you don't expect to find them anywhere, or rather everywhere. You don't expect to find them everywhere. You're grateful and full of admiration when practitioners of politics are able to manifest commitment to the common good and nobility, and not to be swayed by the temptations of politics or the desire for one of the many forms of self-aggrandizement, including financial, that politics often affords. But the idea that that's to be expected, that that's some sort of baseline to build on, will not survive even a first encounter with the real world of politics. And so this book is very autobiographical in a way, because you see me in this book as a political philosopher, as a passionate defender of liberal democracy, and as an advisor to those who would wield power responsibly. That pretty much sums up my life. Right? And each of the 3 sections of the book maps onto one of those defining definitions of how I live my life.
Excellent. No, I mean, that is fascinating, and I feel like the book, if you hear that having not read the book, then you might think there's going to be like personal memoir, but it's very, it's something that you can, I feel like it can feel through the text, but it is not obvious. It's not something, you don't frame it in that kind of personal way, which I think is very impressive, though, that it still comes through that you're someone who's speaking from a place of practical experience and not just abstract philosophical theorizing.
There is one sort of autobiographical move in the book, and that is my discussion. This is actually the entry into lots of things. My discussions of my first experience of Donald Trump. And as I, to summarize what I say in the book, my first reaction was to be horrified. My second reaction was very different. It really, in a way, shaped the book. I said to myself, my God, this is politics stripped to its essentials. A man with a microphone speaking to a crowd. And that realization, led me to one of the central theses of the book. And that is the centrality of speech to politics. It's easy to focus on other things. But if you go back to the beginning of politics, that is what you will find. That is why Aristotle's Rhetoric is perhaps his most political book, because he saw that book as focusing on what distinguishes politics from other forms of activity. And I have a little footnote riff on this triptych. Economics, politics, war. Economics, the central activity is exchange. War, central activity is force or the threat thereof. In politics, the central activity is persuasion. Right? And that, for me, is its defining characteristic. Now, it's easy to get tripped up on that. As a matter of fact, I can easily play both sides of the neck here, because there's, one of my favorite Platonic dialogues is Plato's Gorgias. And if you remember the Gorgias, Socrates goes through a wonderful riff, on persuasion and how it shows up in various forms of activity. And so it's not sufficient to say that politics is defined by persuasion, but I am comfortable with the view that it is the central activity of politics. Now, this may sound very highfalutin, but I have spent many years on buses and in cars in presidential primary contexts. And the threshold question, for any aspiring candidate is, what is your stump speech? Right? That is, what is the 15-minute message? What are you trying to persuade people of? Obviously, you're trying to persuade them that you are the person that they should support. But how are you going to do that? Right? What do you obviously can exemplify certain characteristics in your bearing, in your person, in your self-presentation. It starts there, but it never ends there. Then what? And so the thesis that speech is central to politics is not, for me, a theoretical proposition drawn from the Greeks. It's a very practical proposition drawn from my experience of what distinguishes candidates who have a chance of succeeding from those who have no chance, and it is the power to speak.
I think what this reminds me, I love that you brought up the sort of economics, politics, war, and also acknowledge the sort of the fuzziness of the blurred lines, but it overlaps. But it reminds me that I wanted to get us further into the, we are in this book responding, we see you responding to Trump, but then also, as Laura mentioned, you are taking liberals to task for liberal illusions. And so I think there's a way in which, the critique of neoliberalism, let's say, has often been that there has been a focus on economics, a focus on exchange and interest as the way of avoiding war, as the way of dealing with politics. And that way liberals have also hewed to this rational, self-interested actor model of the human person. And so what would be kind of the main takeaways you want people to have here as we get this discussion going to understand your response to that? Who are you responding to? What are we missing with that model? Why do we need to focus on the dark passions as we talk about this?
Well, first of all, there's a reason that the phrase dark passions has an adjective as well as a noun, because not all passions are dark. Right? But the ones I focus on certainly are. And you can, once again, you can go all the way back to the classics, to see an understanding of why the passions are orthogonal to the analysis of self-interest. I mean, skilled political actors can put passions of their audiences and also their own into a calculus of self-interest. But if you look at the dynamics of the dark passions, you cannot analyze them through the prism of self-interest and understand them as they are. And so, go back to Plato's Republic. There aren't two parts of the soul, the appetitive and the rational. There's something in between, right? And it's that in between that theories of rational self-interest totally leave out. And my argument in the first section of the book is that by trying to reduce the actual triad of the human psyche to a dyad, liberals leave themselves open to people who know how to manipulate the dark passions and those who feel those passions. And every time we succumb to one of the illusions that Laura helpfully ticked off in the beginning of this discussion, liberals disarm themselves in the face of the kinds of attacks that liberalism has always experienced throughout its history. You study Adam Smith, I understand, and as everybody knows, there's the Smith of Wealth of Nations and the Smith of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and a scandalously difficult problem of fitting the two of them together. But Smith, in my view, did not make this mistake, even though his followers typically do. But let me just trace this strand a little. Gosh,
I've got another question. I want to point. Well, you go. You do your thing.
I'm really enjoying this. There's so much to say. There's so much to say, and not enough time to say it. But one of the persistent liberal illusions that can trace all the way back to the 18th century, which I talk about in this book, is the idea that commerce itself can somehow soothe the dark passions. And I quote the famous passage from Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary, where he describes the London Stock Exchange. And the clear message of that description is that commerce will wipe out wars of religion, right? And would that it were so. I talk about Norman Angel's famous book, published on the eve of the First World War, whose central thesis is that the density of commercial relationships that grew up in 50 years of the long peace in Europe had made war irrational. And because war was irrational, it wouldn't happen. Now, he was half right. You know, it did make war irrational. But the conclusion that he drew from that was dead wrong. Why was it dead wrong? Because some of the most important things that human beings do are driven by motives other than the rational self-interest, the sorts of thing that will lead you to calculate quite correctly, you know, that the interruption of commercial relations and the diversion of domestic production to military purposes will leave everybody except the poor profiteers worse off. That, well, I think I've made my point. But it's, you know, and I would say that a very similar illusion grew up after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Once again, you know, globalization, the spread of ties, you know, would create, if not perpetual peace, at least strong motives not to bring the peace. And it was nice while it lasted.
Can I ask you a question about I mean, it's sort of the same question, but it's the question of sort of who do you think the people, it's partly a question of audience for the book, and it's partly a question tied to kind of your experience, like who are the liberals? Because I agree with you, there's sort of this moment in our politics, not a moment, the politics we're living through seems to have caught most liberals sort of flat-footed. I feel this, like I'm flat-footed in response to what's going on, and
Or we all.
yeah, and so there's a kind of, that's clearly happening. But on the other hand, I'm not sure I agree that I don't think you're saying everybody's naive, but I'm curious to get at this question of like who suffers from the illusions the most? Because clearly there are a lot of illusions in our politics, but it's like, are we talking about liberal people generally as a kind of easygoing, sort of asleep at the wheel voters, or are we talking about the people you've worked with in government and the kind of elite think tank world? Because that I'd be really interested to know if like who are you thinking of? You don't have to name names, right? But when you're writing this book, or is it liberal philosophers? Because and in the academy, who seem to be a diminishing group. I mean, I don't even know how many there are these days who are hired for this kind of reading or thinking. You might have a better sense of that than I do, but because we've got such, you know, I don't know. But who's your audience? Who suffers the most from these pathologies?
That's a very good question. And it's not a question that I can answer with the kind of precision that the question invites. But I would say some of all of the above. And you know, some people in the academy, you know, to this day, I believe, continue to embrace what I regard as progressivist illusions. And a good example of that would be Sam Boyne, right, who has written now a series of books and articles basically blasting contemporary liberals for not being progressive enough in the core sense of understanding the basic tendency of human affairs and building on that flow to be more ambitious. The problem with liberal realism is that it constrains ambition. And so from his standpoint, you know, we're sort of leaving money on the table.
Yeah.
Right? And
or I mean, just to defend that, because I'm subject to some of those ideas, right? Isn't it also that we're leaving a kind of energy and generative force that people are thirsting for on the table?
Well, the question of where the energy is a very interesting one. The question of whether the energy is in pursuit of realizable goals is a different one.
Okay.
And And what I've seen in my life is great hopes that didn't pan out, and an enormous backlash and backsliding as a result of that. I mean, there are few people in this room, I guess, not many, who can understand how people felt as the Great Society was being built, right? And not only the programs, but the rhetoric were really extraordinarily expansive in their hopes. And when reality didn't conform to those hopes, there was an intense backlash, which was both intellectual, leading to the rise of neoconservatism. Irving Kristol's famous definition of the neoconservative as the liberal loved by reality, but that wasn't just an elite phenomenon.
Okay.
It was also a public phenomenon, and I think there is evidence that on the public level, the expectation of an ever-improving future was very powerful, and if I could do a potted history of the West since the end of the Second World War, the first 30 years, the famous Trente Glorieux, as the French say, led to expectations, of ever improving conditions of life. That's just the way things were. Now that we've gotten this horrible Second World War behind us, and I just read an article today in Politico reporting on an international survey of how people in Europe and the United States are feeling about the economy. And what comes through all of the answers to all of those questions is this intense sense of hope and disappointment. And if your expectation is ever upward and onward, and that doesn't track the course of history, except in relatively small units, you have a problem. So so taking that particular illusion, the progressivist illusion, and then I think illusions about human nature have played an enormous role in the development of American social policy, really for a century now. I view progressive education as dewy-eyed, with both a capital and a small d. I view a lot of the criminology of the Great Society in exactly the same way. And, well, let's take something very contemporary. Movements to abolish the police and close prisons. I understand the motivation, but I do not agree that those policies rest on a realistic foundation. There is, in one of the books of the Talmud, an aphorism, very Hobbesian aphorism. It goes as follows: pray for the welfare of the government, for if it were not for the government, men would swallow one another alive. And so the idea that unconstrained, we will all do the right thing and treat one another well, if only. And so, I don't think that these are abstractions confined to the academy, not at all, right? It goes much deeper than that, and the backlash against policies built on optimistic illusions has defined much of the past half century of American politics. We have paid a huge price, in my opinion, for policies based on excessive hopes, which is not to say that you abandon the hope of making the world better through politics and public policy.
Okay, thank you.
But it
God.
is,
It's getting dark.
but it is to say that if you don't do it right, if you don't build the edifice of your hopes on solid foundations, you could end up not just back where you began, but worse than that, with the people who invested their hopes in you now heading in an entirely different direction.
Yeah. Kristen, why don't you do one or two more questions and then we'll open it up a bit, okay?
I'm gonna focus on one that I was really dying to ask. That so this book we should keep in mind it's about speech, it's about rhetoric, about theories of human nature and of refocusing on emotions, on passions. But then I want to put this back together with the institutional questions.
Yes.
So, what do you think is the proper relationship between the messaging between political speech and actual policies, and how do we operationalize this into practice? Two things that, and I just a side note on that is I think there's another way in which you can look at the argument as, or a approach to leadership. What does it take for someone to be a good leader, and to make an appeal to their constituents about policies and about the vision of the world we're committed to together. So towards the end of the book, it's pages 125 to 126. You're talking about the backlash to policies around that impacted people in rural and small town America, relating to free trade and the decline of manufacturing jobs. And something you talk about here is you do talk about how normative policies and institutional reforms matter, but you also talk about how politicians didn't acknowledge any of the losses in their speeches. And so I would love to hear you say more on what do you think American politicians, policymakers did wrong in that moment or since then? How would we rectify that? One kind of challenge I would suggest is once we're talking about messaging or speech and today, is it always in the interest to accept responsibility for these things? How do we navigate the fact that I think PR 101 is to not accept responsibility, not apologize, let a scandal blow over, for example, that sort of thing. And maybe is there a tension though between kind of the ideal of a virtuous leadership and what might work well in a PR sense?
Well, I'm not naive enough to believe that the two are always fully compatible. On the other hand, a maxim that goes all the way back to Watergate, that is the cover-up is worse than the crime. You're frequently better off accepting responsibility than denying it. Among other things, I think there is a kind of admiration, that the public feels, for someone they might call casually a stand-up guy, right? What is the essence of a stand-up guy? Someone who doesn't run away from responsibility when things don't go well. And so I don't think the tension between accepting responsibility and prospering politically is nearly as great as the question suggested. But let's get back to the beginning of your question. And here, what I said is shaped by a dimension of my personal experience I haven't talked about before. That is being a grandfather. Okay, being a grandfather is different from being a father. You're a little farther away from the scene of the action. As a result of that, you can see what's going on a little bit more. Right? You're not, first of all, you're not as tired. but secondly, you're not quite as emotionally invested. You are not raising these little beings, right? The biological units are doing that. And so let me tell you something I've noticed, which is very practical. It's the desire for attention. Pay attention. And nothing is more infuriating to a child than demanding attention and not getting it. Right? And that sense of being seen, of being attended to, doesn't end in childhood. Right? We all have it. And so if a particular place or particular slice of the population feels invisible, not seen, not heard, not being paid attention to, not being treated as equal in importance to other people who are being paid attention to, then the reaction to that, is what I spell out in the section of that chapter on resentment, right? If you want to breed resentment, ignore people. Because ignoring people sends the message, you don't matter. And especially in a democracy, that is about the most self-destructive message that you could possibly send. And looking back, the reason I'm going down this road is that looking back, here's a potted history of the last 4 decades. 1990s, the number of manufacturing jobs basically stayed. Between 2001 and 2010, we lost 5.5 million manufacturing jobs, which was fully 30% of our manufacturing base. And looking back at the political debate, I'm astonished at how little attention was paid to that. That was an absolutely formative experience for millions of Americans, their families, and their communities. And I've gone back and I've taken a look at what people were talking about during that period. They weren't talking about that. It wasn't until Donald Trump got elected that suddenly you had scholars and reporters going out almost as cultural anthropologists to try to explain this section of the country that had been completely overlooked in the politics of the previous decade. And so that's what I meant. That's what I meant there. And so when someone comes along and says very explicitly, I see you, I hear you, I'm your champion, I'm your tribute, my God, that's powerful. Against a backdrop of this sense of being neglected and ignored and subject, when you are noticed, subject to a kind of denigration, right? And we all know the famous quotes from Democratic presidential candidates that played straight into this sense. And so, that was the motive for that section that you referred to, this idea of attention and the desire for it as being so fundamental and so essential in a democracy where you don't have a ruling doctrine that says that some people are more important than others and some are naturally subordinate to others or anything of that sort.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I mean, which excellently said, but I think it seems like it's even important, which you do mention in the book, that there are also technological changes, and that's something we're dealing with today too, that were impacting this job loss. If we were to bring back manufacturing jobs today with tariffs and everything, it's not going to be the same because of technological change.
We can bring back manufacturing, but we can't bring back manufacturing jobs.
That's right.
If you want to bring manufacturing back, I'm sure it will be so fully automated that you'll have a few people in white doctor's jackets wandering around supervising the computers, and advanced technology that regulates the production, and so, but, okay,
But even, I just wanna add, even when it's not because of policy, there's a responsibility for people to speak to that experience of loss.
A, speak to it, B, try to figure out what an alternative path to a good life would be, right? And then try to offer options to people who think they're out of options. I just read an article, I think in the Post yesterday, about sentiments in West Virginia, where more than 50% of the disposable income comes from government programs because so much of the economy of the state simply disappeared. That's not a feeling they like, right? They want a future of agency and not passive receipt of what's needed to sustain life. I mean, I could go on in this vein for quite some time, but let me just make one more point that sums up that third and final section, and that is the ability of of political speech to address these dark passions in a positive way, right? And so, as Lauren, Kristen, and other people know, I go through a series of quite well-known speeches where elected officials and candidates for office have been able to go directly at these dark passions, anger, fear, and domination, and have in effect been able to talk people down from them and put them in a frame of mind that points in a more productive direction. And it's a difficult art, that soothing art. The easiest thing in politics is to pour gasoline on a raging fire. Putting out that fire is much more difficult.
All right, thank you. Let's open it up a little bit and take some questions. Is it back there?
Hi, thank you.
Okay, yeah, let's take two at a time, or two or three. Yeah, but we'll go with you first.
This has been fascinating. So I would ask if you could, there are several variables that are going into why liberals have failed. So you mentioned several of them. One is just not knowing what's happening on the ground, being the confirmation bias of expecting things to be in a certain way and not actually being in touch. But there's also this element of question of, we have rights versus the results, right? So is the question, or was the problem that liberals were just thinking of aspirational America and not seeing real America, and therefore not starting from the data, but starting from where they want to go, right? To what extent, like which of these variables is more important and which is more a symptom than the root to the problem?
Okay, and then, yes, go ahead. Sorry, I don't know your name. Maybe tell us your name.
Hello, I'm Nicholas. I might be misunderstanding the book a little bit because I've not had the chance to read it. But as I understand, you're addressing the liberal idea of the rational individual, and your response to that is these dark passions. But I am curious to know your position on liberalism that understands politics through the lens of group dynamics rather than individual dynamics, and how you would apply your idea of the dark passions to group dynamics.
Well, I'll take them in reverse order. I'm not an expert on group dynamics. I mean, I can observe them the way every other aware citizen can, and I know a few things based on solid empirical work, and that is that homogeneous groups tend to become more intense versions of themselves over time. Right? And that's true both online and in person. And so, the polarization of American politics, the weakening or disappearance of, of cross-group bonds in, with common aspirations, with a sense of common enterprise, that the group dynamics produced by the disappearance of heterogeneity and the rise of homogeneity have had a very negative effect. I am not a group psychologist or sociologist, but that much I can say for sure. And so, putting it into my language, groups that share certain passions will tend to become more intense in the expression of those passions. That's bad news. With regard to the first question, I'm afraid I'm in no position to answer, the question with any precision. Which is more important? My answer to your question is I don't know. But I will say this, that I don't see a gap, I don't see a contradiction between thinking realistically and thinking aspirationally. Not at all. What I see is that thinking realistically is a way of building a foundation, for the maximum feasible achievement of aspirations. By understanding what the constraints are, you get some sense of what the limits of feasibility are. Now, there's an elaborate academic literature on the idea of feasibility. Note it and set it aside. In a rough and ready way, in particular situations, you can make judgments short of certainty. Take a look at Aristotle's discussion of deliberation. We don't deliberate about things that we're sure of, right? We deliberate to try to reduce our uncertainty to manageable proportions so we can go forward. My argument is that that our aspirations will be best, most securely, and most enduringly achieved on the basis of a realistic assessment of the situation in which we find ourselves and of the people with whom we share that situation space.
The two gentlemen in the middle there, go ahead.
You're in a unique position to kind of reflect upon the political economy of liberalism and the politics of liberalism from the 1990s onwards.
Yeah.
One of the things that I guess I find a little bit problematic with the categories of dark passions and liberalism and the like is that it doesn't really give us a story of contingency. Bill Clinton's liberalism was a third way of liberalism. There was an alternative. Gephardt represented an alternative which was much more focused on unions. Ross Perot represented a focus on the manufacturing base of the country, but a more corporatist, friendly liberalism won out with Bill Clinton, and characterized as neoliberalism, much more friendly towards globalization and the like. Do you think that there was the possibility of an alternative so that the backlash, which also is very contingent, Trump and its unique kind of moment and going up against Hillary Clinton, do you think there was an alternative for a liberalism that would not have been so vulnerable to the ways in which the right was able to seize the anger of small town America and the anger and the erosion of the manufacturing base?
Well,
Let's take two questions, okay? Just
of course, yes.
Yeah, they fit in well. Thank you for the discussion. Looks like a great book. Looking forward to reading it. You're talking about the dark passions. I'm wondering to what extent you talk about the absence or decline in a lighter passion of empathy. Right, so here I'm thinking about John Rawls and the importance of empathy and looking and stepping inside someone else's shoes for social justice. And were there blind spots that developed among liberals over time with regard to empathy and thinking about deplorables and thinking about even targeting of not going to certain parts of the country because it doesn't make sense to go there. But anyway, just wonder if you might comment on the question of empathy and has that declined among progressives?
That's a very interesting question. Let's once again start with the second question and then go back to the first. Something that I've become aware of is that you have to compare apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And so it's one thing to talk about, as Rawls does, the importance, indeed, the essential nature of the capacity for empathy with others, in the construction and maintenance of a viable liberal democracy. It's another thing to make inferences about, the extent of the existence of that sentiment in the body politic. So, am I sure that empathy has declined? No. I am sure that organized expressions of lack of empathy have risen. Does that mean that people used to be more empathetic than they are now? Or does it mean that those who didn't think that empathy was important may even think of it as a vice? I think Laura has written about some figures on the new right, who would regard empathy, as a vice, as a detraction from the strength.
Excessively feminine.
Yeah.
Exactly, and or a feminine trait that real men shouldn't be prone to. So I don't know whether empathy has declined, but I do know that lack of empathy is much more public than it used to be, and that matters. Okay, with regard to your first question, I absolutely agree with you. That the aspect of, as you put it, contingency is absent from this book. This is a kind of X-ray of certain phenomena. But if I'm trying to tell in a particular circumstance a story involving the dark passions, well, one of the things that I have to talk about is the trigger, right? Because they manifest themselves much more in some periods of history than in others. What is it that triggers them? And that's where policy alternatives, it seems to me, become relevant. I don't talk about that at all in this book, but in order to offer a full explanation of why certain sorts of angry, fearful, and domineering politics arise at some time and not others, you have to talk about the triggering mechanisms. I already talked about one of them, namely what happened to the manufacturing sector in the first decade of the current millennium. And there's more to it than that, but that's certainly a good place to start. Was there a better path? I think there was, and it wouldn't necessarily have taken the form, of a union-centered liberalism, but it would have taken the form of a liberal economics that was realistic from the get-go, that even in circumstances of aggregate gains, that there are bound to be a lot of people who experience individual losses. We did a lousy job of taking that basic fact into account in the pell-mell rush to globalization. Was there an alternative? Conceptually, there certainly was. Was that alternative politically viable? I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that the programs of amelioration and assistance for people who were suffering the downside of globalization were underdeveloped and not, as Brits would say, fit for purpose. And we paid a big price for that. Yeah, we could have done better. But doing better would not necessarily have taken the form of resisting globalization. It would certainly have taken, it would have been globalization plus. And what was missing was the plus. And economists were focused on the aggregates. And they knew theoretically that there was something lurking underneath the aggregates, but in practice, it really didn't figure very much either in the analysis or the policy. And it wasn't until the losses achieved critical mass, by 2010, that you saw first the Tea Party movement and then the rise of Trumpism. And it was, I think you're quite right to suggest that it was a path not taken.
So there you can probably agree with Samuel on some of this story, right? And what in terms of what got us here. Is that fair to say?
Oh, I am very critical and self-critical.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't doing economic policy.
No, I understand that. I just mean, I think in terms of the broader discourse about what got us here,
Yeah.
and why people are angry,
Yeah.
and then the difference between the two. I'm focused on this just because it's sort of how I've been thinking about it. But there's a difference here in terms of what kind of perhaps rhetorical shift is required, and then policy shift. What kind of care you use. You think there's a maybe greater danger in a kind of vaunted, or just an impracticality to certain sort of directions.
Well, that's a very good point, Laura. And let me confess that one of the things that I'm trying to do, in my capacity as behind-the-scenes political advisor, is to develop an agenda of what I call responsible populism.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? That rests on a solid analysis of what's actually going on, that speaks to the anger, but not in a destructive way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I believe, for example, that that the asymmetries of power that have developed on top of the economic asymmetries that have developed in the past 30 years or so are an increasingly important obstacle to the realization and maintenance of liberal democracy. And so, do I favor tax reform that makes the billionaires and others pay their fair share, and that strips corporations of tax advantages they get that small businesses and individuals don't? You bet I am. Am I in favor of recognizing that certain government instrumentalities like regulation are easy for large corporations to deal with?
Right.
If you're a small business person or an individual entrepreneur, they're almost impossible to deal with. Yeah, all of that, I think, is part of a better and fuller liberal economic and social agenda for the next generation.
Okay, I think we're going to end it there because we've gone over. We've got and some of us will have the opportunity to talk to Bill a little later tonight. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. That will be